The first miracle Jesus ever performed did not happen in a temple. It did not happen in the wilderness after 40 days of fasting. It did not happen in a synagogue, in front of religious leaders, or in a setting that would have announced itself as obviously sacred and significant. The first miracle of Jesus happened at a wedding party, with music playing, with people dancing, with laughter spilling out into the night air of a small village in Galilee called Cana. And Jesus was there, not as an observer watching from a distance, not as a reluctant attendee, fulfilling a social obligation, but as an invited guest who came willingly, who brought his disciples with him, and who was present, fully, genuinely, humanly present in the middle of the celebration. This is the first thing the story of the wedding at Cana tells us, and it is more important than it might initially appear. Think about what Jesus could have chosen for his first public miracle. He had just returned from 40 days of fasting in the wilderness, where he had defeated Satan's most sophisticated temptations. He had begun calling disciples. The Son of God, the long-awaited Messiah, the one whom John the Baptist had declared would baptize with the Holy Spirit, this person, beginning his public ministry, could have announced himself in any number of dramatic and theologically weighty ways. He could have walked into the Jerusalem temple and cleansed it as a first act. He could have stood on a hillside and delivered a manifesto that would have shaken the religious establishment to its foundation. He could have healed someone visibly and unmistakably in the most public place possible, making the announcement of his arrival impossible to ignore. Instead, he went to a wedding. He sat at the table. He ate the food. He accepted the hospitality of people who were celebrating the beginning of a marriage. And he chose this ordinary, joyful, completely human occasion as the stage for the first revelation of his glory. We need to let this land with its full weight, because so many of us have absorbed a version of Christianity that has unconsciously separated God from ordinary human joy. We have divided life into the sacred and the secular, the church service and the birthday party, the prayer meeting and the family dinner, the solemn religious moment and the laughing until it hurts evening with people you love. And we have placed God firmly on one side of that divide. He is present in the serious, the reverent, the formally religious. He tolerates, or perhaps merely permits, the other side of life. The celebrations, the parties, the moments of simple, unadorned human delight. The wedding at Cana refuses that division entirely. Jesus did not attend the wedding reluctantly while waiting to get back to more important ministry. The wedding was the ministry. The joy was not incidental to what Jesus was doing there. It was the point. He was present in that celebration because the God who designed human beings designed them for joy. And he cares deeply and personally about the joy of the people he made. There is something in the Gospel of John's framing of this moment that should not be overlooked. John records this miracle as the first of the signs through which Jesus revealed his glory. Not a healing, not a resurrection, not a dramatic confrontation with the forces of darkness. A wedding, an act of hospitality, a moment of celebration rescued from embarrassment and restored to joy. This is what glory looks like when it arrives in the middle of ordinary human life. Not always in the earthquake and the fire and the still, small voice of high religious drama. Sometimes in the moment when the celebration that was about to fall apart is quietly, miraculously restored. Consider also who was there with Jesus. His mother Mary, his newly called disciples, men who had just left their fishing nets and their tax booths to follow this rabbi from Nazareth, and who were still very much figuring out what that meant. These were not men who had completed a spiritual formation program. They were ordinary people at the beginning of an extraordinary journey, sitting at a wedding table, eating and drinking and being present in the most uncomplicated human way. And Jesus was with them, fully, without any indication that he was enduring the festivities while waiting for a more appropriate spiritual context. This matters profoundly for every person watching this who has been living under the quiet, unspoken burden of feeling that their ordinary life, their Tuesday evenings and their family gatherings, and their moments of simple happiness is spiritually second class. That God is present in the church service but merely tolerating the rest of your week. That the gap between your regular life and your spiritual life is evidence of something missing in your faith. The wedding at Cana says otherwise. God was invited to the party, and he came. Not with reluctance, not as a concession to human weakness, but willingly, genuinely, as an honored guest, who was about to demonstrate that his presence transforms every ordinary thing it touches into something extraordinary. The invitation had been extended. Jesus had accepted it. He was at the table, and something was about to happen that would change not only the evening, but the understanding of everyone present about who this man from Nazareth actually was and what his presence in any situation is capable of producing. The celebration was in full swing. The wine was flowing, the music was playing, and nobody yet knew that a crisis was quietly developing in the back of the house, in the storage area where the wine jars stood. Nobody knew that the most important moment of the evening was not the one they were currently enjoying, but the one that was about to arrive, the moment when the celebration ran out of what it needed most. And a mother noticed, and a son acted. And ordinary water became the finest wine that had ever been served at a wedding in Cana. But before any of that could happen, someone had to notice that the wine was running out. And the person who noticed was not the head servant, not the groom, not the master of the banquet. It was a mother who knew her son, and she had been watching him all evening with the quiet, knowing eyes of someone who understood that the most important guest at this wedding had not yet done what she suspected he was capable of doing. The celebration was at its height. The music was playing, the guests were dancing, the food was abundant, and the joy of the evening had reached that particular pitch of warmth and laughter that a wedding celebration achieves when everything is going exactly right. From the outside, from the perspective of any guest looking around the room, there was no crisis. There was only celebration. But somewhere in the back of the house, a servant tilted a wine jar and found it empty. Tilted another. Empty. Looked at the row of storage vessels and understood, with the sudden cold clarity of someone who has just made a discovery that cannot be undone, that the wine was gone. Not running low, gone, and the wedding celebration had hours yet to go. In the modern world, running out of wine at a party is an inconvenience. Someone makes a quick trip to the store. The host apologizes briefly. Life continues. But in first-century Jewish wedding culture, this was not an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe. Jewish wedding celebrations lasted not hours, but days, sometimes an entire week, and the obligation of hospitality that rested on the groom's family was not a social nicety, but a binding cultural and moral responsibility. To fail to provide adequately for your guests was a public disgrace that could follow a family for years. In a small village community where everyone knew everyone, and relationships and reputations were the fabric of daily life, running out of wine was not just embarrassing, it was shameful. It was the kind of failure that people would still be talking about a decade later. The wedding that ran out of wine, the family that couldn't provide, the groom who couldn't sustain the celebration he had promised. The joy that had been filling the room was still visible on the surface. The music was still playing. The guests were still dancing. But the crisis was real, and it was unfolding in the hidden places, in the storage room, in the whispered conversations between servants, in the growing awareness of the household staff that something had gone very wrong and that there was no obvious solution available. This is the texture of the crisis that the wedding at Cana presents. Not a visible, dramatic emergency, but a hidden one. Not a suffering that announced itself to the room, but a depletion that existed behind the scenes, invisible to the celebrating guests, carried quietly by the people responsible for making sure the celebration continued. The party was still happening. The joy was still present in the faces of the guests. But in the hidden places, the well was dry. There is something about this particular shape of crisis, the one that hides behind a still functioning exterior, that is more familiar to most of us watching this than any other kind. Because most of us are not experiencing the visible, obvious, everything has collapsed in public kind of emptiness. Most of us are living inside the wedding that has run out of wine, the celebration that is still technically happening, the life that from the outside looks like it is going fine. You are showing up to work. You are present at the family dinner. You are in the church pew on Sunday morning. You are going through the motions of a life that by external measure appears to be functioning. But in the hidden places, in the storage room of your interior life, the wine ran out a while ago. The joy that used to be present in your marriage has been replaced by a quiet, exhausted coexistence. The passion that once made you leap out of bed with energy for the work you believed you were called to has been replaced by going through the motions. Competence that keeps the machine running without any of the fire that used to power it. The faith that was once vivid and immediate and personal. The faith that made you genuinely excited to pray, genuinely moved by worship, genuinely convinced that something real and alive was happening in your relationship with God, has been replaced by a familiar religious practice that is correct in every external form and empty in the place where it used to be full. And the particular cruelty of this kind of emptiness is the layer of shame that comes with it, because from the outside everything still looks fine. The party is still going, which means that the people around you don't know about the empty jars in the back, which means you can't bring yourself to tell anyone, which means you carry it alone, managing the public celebration while privately panicking about the private depletion. The groom's family knew they had run out of wine, and they could not announce it to the room. That would have been to admit the failure in the most public possible way. So they kept the music playing, and they kept the guests dancing, and they prayed that nobody would notice until they could figure something out. That silence, the silence of carrying a hidden depletion in a context that requires you to keep performing celebration, is the emotional center of this story. And it is the experience of far more people than any of us would guess from looking at the room. But here is what the story shows us about God in the middle of this particular kind of crisis. Before the groom knew, before the master of the banquet knew, before any of the guests noticed that anything was wrong, before the crisis had been publicly acknowledged or officially declared a problem requiring intervention, Mary knew. She had seen something in the household, in the quiet urgency of a servant's face, in the tilt of an empty jar, in some small signal that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. And Mary did not go to the groom. She did not call a meeting with the household staff. She did not begin working on a solution. She went to Jesus. Notice that the crisis was hidden, and Jesus was already at the table. He had not been waiting at a distance, ready to intervene if summoned. He was there, already present in the celebration, already in the room where the joy was happening, and from which the joy was beginning to drain. And before anyone had officially asked him to do anything, before anyone had formally acknowledged that there was a problem requiring his attention, he was about to be invited into the hidden emptiness by the one person who understood both the depth of the need and the fullness of what he was capable of bringing to it. God is already at your table. He was not waiting to be invited into your celebration until you had perfected it or resolved its hidden crises. or brought it up to a standard worthy of his presence. He accepted the invitation into your ordinary, imperfect, still functioning on the outside life a long time ago. And the question now is the same one that the servants were about to face when he gives the instruction that doesn't make immediate sense. When the direction he gives seems inadequate to the size of the problem, will you fill the jars anyway? Will you trust the process even before you understand the outcome? Before we get there, we need to watch what Mary does next, because what she does in the next few moments is one of the most instructive and most underappreciated examples of faithful intercession in the entire New Testament. Mary noticed, and the moment she noticed, she knew exactly what to do. Not because she had a plan, not because she understood what the solution was going to look like or how it was going to work, or what exactly her son was going to do about a wine shortage at a wedding celebration in Cana, but because she had spent 30 years watching this person, and she knew with the deep, unhurried certainty of a mother who has been paying attention that whatever the problem was, he was the right person to bring it to. She walked through the celebration to where Jesus was sitting, and she leaned close to him and said 5 words. In the original language, it may have been even fewer syllables than that. She said, "They have no wine." That is the entire prayer. No elaborate petition, no carefully reasoned theological argument for why Jesus ought to intervene, no detailed explanation of the social consequences that would follow if the wine shortage became public, no suggestions about what the solution might look like or what she expected him to do, no conditions, no qualifications, no negotiating, just the simple, direct statement of the need as she understood it. They have no wine. There is an entire theology of prayer contained in these 5 words, and it is almost the exact opposite of what most American Christians have been taught prayer is supposed to look like. We have absorbed from various traditions and teachings and well-meaning spiritual mentors the idea that effective prayer is elaborate prayer, that God responds most fully to the prayers that are longest, most specific, most theologically sophisticated, most passionately delivered. We feel vaguely guilty about short prayers. We feel like we need to explain the situation to God in detail, as though he might not be fully aware of the circumstances unless we brief him thoroughly. We feel compelled to suggest solutions, to lay out the options we have already considered and found inadequate, to make the case for why our request is reasonable and worthy of divine attention. Mary brought none of that. She brought the raw reality of the need and the complete trust that he who was hearing it would know what to do with it. They have no wine. I am not telling you what to do about it. I am not suggesting a timeline. I am not specifying outcomes. I am simply telling you the truth about what is missing, because I trust that you already understand everything I can't put into words, and I trust that what you do with this information will be better than anything I could plan. Jesus' response to Mary's prayer is one of the most debated exchanges in the Gospels. He said, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Generations of readers have wrestled with the apparent sharpness of this response. The formal address, woman, seeming to create distance. The reference to his hour seeming to be a refusal. And if Mary had been the kind of person who prayed only when she was confident of a yes, she would have taken this response as a no and returned to her seat. But Mary understood something about the relationship between what Jesus said and what Jesus would do that went beyond the surface reading of his words. 30 years. 30 years of watching this son. 30 years of sitting with the mystery of who he was and what he had come to do. She had treasured things in her heart, pondering them, since the night the shepherds came and the angels sang and the old man. Simeon held the infant Jesus in the temple and spoke of swords that would pierce her soul. She had watched him grow in wisdom and stature. She had seen things in him, over 30 years of ordinary daily life, that nobody else on earth had seen. And whatever his words meant on the surface, something in her, something cultivated by 3 decades of paying attention, told her that the answer was not no. She turned to the servants, and she said the most important words she ever spoke in her entire life. Whatever he tells you, do it. Not if he tells you. Not when you understand why he's telling you. Not after you've evaluated whether his instructions make sense in light of the problem you're trying to solve. Whatever he tells you, do it. This is the hinge that the entire miracle turns on. Not Jesus' power, which was never in question. Not the quality of the need, which was real, but not in the cosmic scheme of things, an earth-shaking emergency. The hinge is Mary's complete, unqualified transfer of the problem from her hands to his, followed by her instruction to everyone within earshot to extend the same complete surrender to his direction. Whatever he tells you. The word whatever is doing enormous theological work in that sentence. It rules out the partial obedience that says, I'll follow this instruction because it makes sense to me. It rules out the conditional obedience that says, I'll do what he says up to the point where it becomes inconvenient or confusing. It rules out the negotiated obedience that says, I'll comply with the general direction while making some modifications that seem more practical to me. Whatever he tells you encompasses the instructions that make immediate sense and the instructions that don't, the directions that are easy to follow, and the ones that require you to act before you understand the outcome, the commands that align with your expectation of how God works, and the ones that confuse you, because they look nothing like what you thought the solution would require. Whatever he tells you, do it. There is a reason this instruction became the operating principle for everyone involved in the miracle that followed. Because what Jesus was about to tell the servants to do was going to require exactly the kind of complete, trust without comprehension, obedience that Mary's words prepared them for. He was not going to explain himself first. He was not going to provide a theological rationale for the instructions he was about to give. He was simply going to tell them to do something that, on the surface, had nothing to do with solving a wine shortage at a wedding, and the miracle was going to happen in the space between the instruction and the understanding. The servants were about to find out what every person who has ever genuinely followed. Jesus eventually discovers that his instructions often look nothing like the solution you were expecting, that the obedience he requires often precedes the understanding he provides, and that the most extraordinary things God ever does in a human life happen in the space between the doing and the knowing why. Mary had done her part. She had brought the need. She had trusted the hearing of it to the one who could actually do something about it. And she had released the servants into the only posture that makes receiving a miracle possible. Complete, unqualified, whatever you say, readiness. The servants were waiting. Jesus was about to speak. And what he said next was going to sound to anyone listening without faith like it had nothing to do with the problem at hand. Jesus looked at the servants, and he gave them an instruction. Fill the jars with water, 6 stone water jars, each one enormous, holding between 20 and 30 gallons, which means the full set of 6 held somewhere between 120 and 180 gallons combined. These were not decorative vessels. They were the ceremonial purification jars that Jewish households kept for ritual washing the water used for the religious cleansing required before meals, the careful religious observance that had nothing to do with thirst or celebration or the joy of a wedding feast. They were the containers of religious obligation, duty, procedure, the formal practice that kept the household in compliance with the law. And they were empty. Fill them with water, not go and purchase more wine from the market. Not water down what little wine remains so it stretches further. Not find another source of wine that can be brought in quickly before the guests notice. Not even stand back and watch what I'm about to do. Simply fill the jars with water. The plain, unglamorous, completely ordinary water drawn from a well or a cistern. The kind of water that has no transformative potential, no natural relationship to the wine that the celebration needs, no quality in itself that suggests it is about to become anything more than what it already is. The instruction is completely disconnected on the surface from the problem it is intended to address. There is no logical pathway in a servant's mind from, "We have run out of wine," to, "Fill the purification jars with water." Water is not wine. Purification jars are not wine vessels. The instruction does not look like a solution. It looks like a religious chore being inserted into the middle of a crisis, a directive that seems to be asking the servants to perform a ritual act when what is actually needed is a practical solution. And yet the servants filled them. The Bible records it with a single remarkable detail. They filled them to the brim. Not halfway, not mostly full, not as full as they thought was probably sufficient for whatever purpose this was going to serve. To the brim. Every jar. All 120 to 180 gallons of it. Completely, maximally, overflowingly full. This detail is not incidental. It is one of the most important pieces of information in the entire story, because the servants did not know what Jesus was going to do with those jars of water. They could not have known because nothing in their experience or their understanding of how the world works would have suggested what was about to happen. They were filling ceremonial water jars in the middle of a wine shortage, following an instruction that made no immediate logical sense, with no explanation provided and no outcome guaranteed. And they filled him to the brim. They gave him everything, not partial compliance, not hedged obedience, not the minimum required to technically satisfy the instruction. They filled every jar to its maximum capacity, which means they were still drawing water and carrying it and pouring it into stone vessels, long after the basic meaning of the instruction had been satisfied. They kept going until there was no more room, until every available container was as full as it could possibly be, until the obedience was as complete as the instruction had asked for, and then a little more complete than that. The completeness of their obedience was not a condition that activated the miracle. God's power is not contingent on our performance level, but the completeness of the filling is a picture of the kind of availability that makes transformation possible. A half-filled jar is a divided commitment. A mostly filled jar is a mostly surrendered life. The jar filled to the brim, right to the very edge of its capacity, with no room held back and no space reserved for something else. That jar is the picture of a person who has brought everything they have to the moment of obedience and left nothing in reserve. Think about what it took for these servants to fill those jars. Physical effort, drawing water, carrying it, pouring it, going back for more, repeating the process until 6 massive stone vessels were overflowing. Time in the middle of a crisis that was pressing in on the household staff from every direction. Faith, or at least the obedient equivalent of faith, the willingness to follow an instruction that made no sense without any assurance of how it would turn out, and the silence of not asking questions. The servants did not negotiate. They did not ask Jesus to explain himself first. They did not take a vote on whether this seemed like a reasonable approach to a wine shortage. They heard the instruction. They obeyed completely. There is a deep and practical word here for every person who has been sitting in their area of depletion, asking God to refill what has run dry, and wondering why the miracle hasn't arrived yet. The question worth asking is not, why isn't God acting? The question worth asking is, what has he said to do that I have not yet done? Or perhaps more precisely, what has? He said to do that I have partially done, that I have done to the halfway mark or the mostly full mark, but not yet to the brim. Because the invitation in this story is not first to receive a miracle. It is first to fill the jars, to bring the full measure of obedience to whatever instruction he has given, without holding back the portion that is inconvenient or confusing or doesn't yet make sense. The servants didn't understand why they were filling purification jars with water, but they filled them anyway, completely. And the miracle happened in the fullness of their compliance, not in the explanation that preceded. And here is what makes this moment so theologically rich. The jars Jesus chose were the purification jars, the containers of religious obligation, the vessels that represented the formal religious practice of the household, the ritual, the procedure, the dutiful compliance with the law that had become, perhaps, more about habit than about encounter. Jesus took the containers of religious duty and turned them into vessels of miracle. He took the water of ordinary religious observance and transformed it into the best wine that anyone at that wedding had ever tasted. This is what Jesus does with our religious regularity when we bring it to him fully. The morning prayer that has felt routine for years. The Sunday attendance that has continued through seasons when it felt more obligatory than alive. The Bible reading that has sometimes been more discipline than delight. The tithe given faithfully, even in the months when the faith behind the giving felt thin. These are your purification jars filled with the water of faithful but sometimes dry religious practice. And Jesus does not despise them. He does not tell you that because the practice has felt routine, it is worthless. He says, fill them to the brim. Bring the full measure of your ordinary faithfulness. And watch what I can do with the water of your regular, imperfect, continuing, even when it's hard, obedience. The jars were full. 6 enormous stone vessels, filled to the absolute brim with completely ordinary water. And Jesus turned to the servants and gave them the next instruction. Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. The servants reached in. They drew out what they had poured in. And what came out of those jars was not what had gone in. The miracle had happened silently, completely, without drama or announcement or any visible moment of transformation. The water was gone. The wine was there, and it was the finest wine anyone in that room had ever tasted. Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. The servants reached into the jars. They drew out what they had poured in. And somewhere between the pouring in and the drawing out in the quiet, unwitnessed, undramatic space between obedience and result, the miracle had already happened. Nobody saw the moment of transformation. Nobody was positioned at the rim of the jar watching the precise instant when water became wine. The Bible does not record a flash of light, a sound, a visible sign that something supernatural was occurring inside those stone vessels. There was simply the water that went in and the wine that came out, and the silent, complete, utterly unannounced miracle that happened in between. The servants carried what they had drawn to the master of the banquet. The master of the banquet was the person responsible for overseeing the wedding feast, the ancient equivalent of a wedding coordinator, the one whose job it was to manage the food and the wine and the flow of the celebration. He tasted what the servant brought him, and the text records his reaction not with religious language or theological reflection, but with the most human, immediate, surprised response available to a man who has just put something in his mouth that has exceeded every expectation he brought to the table. He called the bridegroom over, and he said, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This is the sentence that contains the theological heart of the entire miracle. And it deserves to be read slowly because it is saying something about God's way of working that is almost exactly opposite to the logic of the world we live in. The master of the banquet was describing a universal human pattern. It is the pattern of the world, and every honest person recognizes it from their own experience. In the beginning, things are at their best. The new relationship crackles with energy and excitement, and the particular electricity of two people discovering each other. The new job is full of possibility and engagement and the feeling that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The new city is full of adventure. The new church is full of connections that feel like they were made specifically for you. The new year is full of potential. The new anything carries the freshness that newness always brings. And we are drawn toward it with the unreasoned enthusiasm of creatures who have learned to associate novelty with quality. And then, with almost mathematical reliability, the good wine runs out. Not always dramatically, not always in a single catastrophic event, often gradually, the way a tide goes out imperceptibly at first, then undeniably. The relationship that was electric becomes comfortable, then routine, then something you maintain rather than something you inhabit with joy. The job that was engaging becomes familiar, then manageable, then something you endure rather than something you love. The faith that was vivid becomes practiced, then habitual, then a structure you inhabit without always feeling the life inside it. The world's wine follows the world's pattern, good at the beginning, declining as time passes, until what remains is a pale version of what it once was. Every person over the age of 30 watching this knows exactly what the master of the banquet was describing, because every person over the age of 30 has lived it. The freshness becomes familiarity. The passion becomes routine. The wine gets thinner. And the world's answer to this is always the same. Find new wine. Start over. Get the freshness back by finding something fresh. A new relationship, a new career, a new city, a new church, a new anything. Reset the clock so the good wine can flow again from the beginning. Keep moving toward the new, because the new is always better than the old. And the only way to have good wine is to keep pouring new wine. And then the master of the banquet tasted what was in his cup. And what he tasted was not what this pattern had prepared him to receive. What he tasted was better than what they had served at the beginning of the evening. Not equally good, not comparable, better. The wine that arrived after the wine had run out, the wine that came through the most improbable channel imaginable, drawn from stone purification jars that had been filled with ordinary water by servants following an instruction they didn't fully understand, was the finest wine of the entire evening. You have kept the good wine until now. This is the pattern of God, and it is the direct inversion of the world's pattern, where the world's logic says that the best things come first and decline follows. God's logic says that what he is building moves in the opposite direction, that the wine he brings grows, richer and deeper and better with time, that the end of his story is always more glorious than its beginning, that the later chapters contain something that the earlier chapters were only preparing the ground for. This is not wishful thinking dressed up in theological language. This is the testimony of every person who has walked with God across decades and been honest about what they found on the other side of the seasons that felt like running out. The marriages that went through the death of the early wine and came out the other side with something quieter and deeper and more unshakable than the first passion ever was. The faith that was stripped of its early excitement and rebuilt on something more real and more durable than the emotion that had carried it in the beginning. The lives that were emptied of everything they had been built on, and then filled slowly, quietly, completely, with something that tasted nothing like what had been lost, but was, in the end, better. You have kept the good wine until now. Not you wasted the good wine and now you are left with nothing. Not the good wine is gone and what remains is inferior. But what is in your cup right now, in this moment, After everything that is run out and everything that has been emptied and everything that looked like the end of the celebration, this is the good wine, the best wine, the wine he has been saving for this moment. There is a specific, important word from this miracle for everyone who is watching this and thinking my best days are behind me. The marriage I dreamed of didn't survive. The career I built collapsed. The faith I used to have feels like a memory. The person I was going to become got derailed somewhere along the way, and what remains is a diminished version of what I hoped for. The good wine was served, and now it's gone, and what I'm holding is what's left. The master of the banquet is standing in front of you with an expression of absolute astonishment, and he is saying, you don't know what you're holding. Taste it. Because what God has been preparing through everything that ran out, and everything that felt empty, and everything that looked like the end of the celebration, it is not inferior to what you had before. It is the wine he saved for this moment, and it is the best wine yet. Let's go back to the stone jars for a moment, because there is something about those 6 vessels that has not yet been fully explored. And it contains one of the most personally applicable truths in the entire story. The jars that Jesus chose to work through were not wine vessels. They were purification jars, the stone containers used for Jewish ritual washing, filled with water for the religious cleansing required by the law. They had a specific, defined religious purpose. They were the containers of duty, of obligation, of the formal practice that kept the household in compliance with the requirements of their faith. They were not vessels of joy or celebration or abundance. They were vessels of religious correctness, and they were the containers Jesus chose. Think about what this means for you. Jesus did not create new vessels for his miracle. He did not bring in custom containers specially designed for the wine he was about to produce. He took what was already there, the existing, familiar, everyday containers of the household's religious life, and he worked through them. He took the vessels of ordinary, sometimes dry religious practice and used them as the instruments of extraordinary, joyful, overflowing abundance. This is a direct word for every person who has been showing up to the religious practices of their faith through seasons when those practices felt hollow. The morning prayer that has felt like talking into the ceiling. The church attendance that has felt more obligatory than transformative. The Bible reading that has sometimes been more discipline than delight. The worship that has felt like going through motions rather than encountering something alive and real. If you have been faithfully maintaining the practices of your faith through seasons of spiritual dryness, feeling vaguely guilty that the containers of your religious life are filled with water rather than wine, hear this. Jesus uses the purification jars. He works through the vessels that are already in the house, already being maintained, already filled, even when they are filled with something as plain and untransformed as water. Your faithfulness in the dry seasons is not wasted. Your continued showing up when it doesn't feel like anything is happening is not pointless religious performance. Those practices, those water-filled stone jars of faithful, imperfect, continuing even when it's hard religious life, are precisely what Jesus chooses to work through when the moment of transformation comes. The servants filled those jars to the brim. Not half, not mostly full, to the brim, which means the miracle, when it came, was not limited by the available container. It had the full measure of the servant's obedience to work through. The transformation was complete because the filling was complete. There was no partially filled jar that yielded only partially transformed results. The completeness of the obedience matched the completeness of the miracle. There is an invitation in this for every area of your life where the wine has run out. What would it look like to fill those jars to the brim? Not to halfway surrender the depleted marriage and halfway continue managing the distance. Not to mostly recommit to the faith that has gone dry, while holding back the part of you that is still protecting itself from disappointment. Not to partially open the area of your life where the joy has gone and partially keep the door closed. To fill the jar completely. To bring the full measure of your obedience and your availability and your honest need to the one who can transform what you bring. The miracle happened in the fullness of the filling. And the same principle operates in every area of depletion you bring to Jesus today. But there is one more dimension of this miracle that we must not leave without exploring, because it is the dimension that carries the most weight. For the long-term pattern of a life that is learning what it means to trust a God who saves his best for last. The servants did not know when they filled the jars with water what the water was going to become. They obeyed without a preview of the outcome. They completed the task without a guarantee attached to the instruction. They brought their full obedience to a direction that, on the surface, bore no visible relationship to the problem it was intended to address. And the miracle happened on the other side of their trust, not before. This is the consistent pattern of how God works in human lives. He does not typically provide the preview before asking for the trust. He does not show you the wine before asking you to fill the jars with water. He gives the instruction, fill the jars. And the transformation happens in the obedience, not in the explanation. Which means that the faith required to receive a miracle from God is always at its root a faith that acts before it sees. A faith that fills the jars with water because Jesus said to, without first understanding how water becomes wine. This is harder than it sounds, because what we want, what every honest person wants, is to understand the path before committing to walk it. We want to see the wine before we start drawing water. We want the assurance of outcome before we undertake the vulnerability of complete obedience. We want the master of the banquet to taste the miraculous wine and confirm that it's real before we spend our energy on filling stone jars with something that looks nothing like a solution. But that is not how the miracle at Cana worked, and it is not how God works in the depleted places of your life. The instruction comes before the understanding. The filling comes before the transformation. The obedience comes before the evidence. And the good wine, the best wine, the wine he has been saving for this moment, is waiting on the other side of the trust. Fill the jars. Fill them to the brim. Bring the full measure of your honest need and your available obedience to the one who turned water into wine at a wedding in Cana. And then listen for the instruction, however unexpected it might sound, however disconnected it might appear from the specific problem you are trying to solve. Because the next thing he tells you to do may be the thing that turns the water in your stone jars into the finest wine you have ever tasted. This was the first miracle Jesus ever performed. Sit with that for a moment. Not the raising of Lazarus, not the feeding of 5,000, not the healing of the blind or the cleansing of the lepers or the calming of the storm. The first thing Jesus did, the first public demonstration of the glory that John tells us, he revealed at Cana, was to save a wedding party from embarrassment by turning ordinary water into extraordinary wine. He could have chosen anything for his first miracle. The options available to the Son of God for inaugurating his public ministry were essentially unlimited. He could have healed the most visibly sick person in Galilee and announced his arrival with undeniable compassion. He could have walked into the Jerusalem temple and made a statement that would have immediately defined the theological agenda of his ministry. He could have performed a miracle of such cosmic scale that there would have been no ambiguity whatsoever about who he was and what he had come to do. He chose joy. He chose a wedding. He chose the moment when a celebration was about to fall apart and restored it to something better than it had been. He chose to make his first revelation of divine glory through an act of overflowing, abundant, this is better than anyone expected celebration. This is not a minor or incidental detail. It is a declaration about who God is, and what God cares about that runs directly counter to the image of God that much of American Christianity has unconsciously cultivated. We have, in many of our traditions, produced a God who is primarily serious, primarily demanding, primarily focused on the weight of sin and the gravity of salvation and the earnest, sober business of Christian discipleship. A God who can be understood through the categories of law and obligation and duty and sacrifice, all of which are real and true and essential, but who somehow seems uncomfortable in the categories of laughter and celebration and the uncomplicated pleasure of a good meal with people you love at a wedding in Cana. The first miracle says otherwise. The God who spoke the universe into existence, who set the stars in their places, and determined the boundaries of the oceans and breathed life into the first human being. That God showed up at a wedding party and used his first public exercise of miraculous power to make sure the party could continue. Not just continue, but reach a level of celebration that exceeded what it had been before the crisis. He did not merely restore the wine to what it had been. He elevated the wine to something the master of the banquet had never encountered. He chose for his inaugural miracle to overflow. What does this tell us about God? It tells us that joy is not peripheral to who he is. It tells us that the restoration of human celebration is not a secondary concern that he gets to after the more serious theological business is handled. It tells us that when Jesus said he came that we might have life and have it abundantly, he meant something that included the wine, the joy, the celebration, the full, overflowing, better than expected human experience of being alive and loved and present in a moment of shared delight. Jesus said in the upper room, shortly before his death, "These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. Not that you may endure faithfully, not that you may comply correctly, that your joy may be full." He used the word full, the way the servants filled the jars completely, maximally, to the brim, with no space held back and no capacity underutilized. The joy he intends for the people he loves is full joy, brim full, overflowing. The best wine kept for last, served in abundance. This matters enormously for every person watching this who has been living inside a version of Christianity that is heavy with obligation and thin on joy, who has been dutifully practicing the faith, doing the right things in the right order, showing up and serving and giving and praying and experiencing very little of the abundant life that Jesus described as the purpose of his coming, whose stone jars are full of the water of correct religious practice, but who cannot remember the last time the wine flowed freely, whose faith has become a serious, responsible, correctly conducted arrangement with God that bears almost no resemblance to the overflowing celebration that the master of the banquet tasted at Cana. If that is you, then this first miracle is a direct message to you from the God who chose a wedding party as the location for his inaugural demonstration of glory. He is not satisfied with your correct religious compliance. He is not glorified by your dutiful endurance. He wants your joy, full joy, brimful, overflowing. This is better than I expected joy. And he is not waiting for you to earn it or achieve it or produce it through the right combination of spiritual disciplines. He is waiting to transform the water in your purification jars into something that will make the master of your inner life taste and say you have saved the best for now. The first miracle was a miracle of joy, chosen deliberately, on purpose, by a God who cares deeply and personally and practically about whether the celebration of your life has enough wine in it. And he is the same God today that he was at Cana, the God who came to the party, who stayed at the table, who noticed when the wine ran out, who worked through the plain water of faithful obedience to produce something extraordinary, who saved the best for last. His joy is not for the other side of eternity only. It is available now in the depleted areas of your present life, in the marriages and the careers and the faith and the dreams where the wine has run dry. He is still turning water into wine. He is still saving the best for the later hours of the celebration. He is still the God who chose a wedding party as his first miracle, and who has been multiplying joy in the ordinary and faithful and imperfect lives of his people ever since. The wedding at Cana is over. The servants have gone home. The stone jars are empty again, this time not from depletion, but from abundance. Every last drop of the miraculous wine drawn out and shared with the celebrating guests. The disciples who were there that evening went away believing, the text tells us, for the first time with the full weight of what that word means. Something had shifted. Something had been revealed. Something about who Jesus was had become visible in the transformation of 120 to 180 gallons of ordinary water into the finest wine anyone at the party had ever tasted. And the story hands itself over to you. Because the Cana miracle is not a historical curiosity about a wedding that happened 2,000 years ago in a small Galilean village. It is a living invitation addressed to every person who is currently holding an empty jar. And the question the story asks, quietly, persistently, with the unhurried patience of a God who has been saving his best wine for your particular moment, is simply this. What are your empty jars? You know what they are. You have known for a while, probably. The area of your life where the wine ran out, where the joy that was once present has been replaced by the dry, careful management of an ongoing situation that you have stopped expecting to overflow. Maybe it is the marriage that is still technically functioning, but from which the celebration has long since departed. Two people sharing a house and a life and a set of obligations, and almost none of the wine that made the beginning of the relationship feel like a party worth attending. Maybe it is the career or the calling that you pursued with genuine passion and from which the passion has, somewhere along the way, quietly drained, leaving behind the competence without the fire, the work without the joy, the results without the aliveness that used to make the work feel like more than work. Maybe it is the faith. This is the emptiness that is hardest to admit because it carries a particular layer of shame in Christian community. The shame of the person whose religious jar is technically filled with the water of correct practice, but who cannot remember the last time that water tasted like wine. You are still going, still praying, still showing up, still filling the purification jars with the water of faithful, dutiful, continuing obedience. But the transformation, the alive, overflowing, this is better than anything quality that the master of the banquet tasted at Cana, that has been absent for long enough that you have started to wonder whether it was ever really there, or whether what you experienced in the beginning was simply the freshness of something new. Bring those jars to Jesus, all of them. The depleted marriage and the burned-out calling and the dry faith and the dream that lost its momentum, and the joy that you have been managing the absence of for longer than you want to count. Bring them the way Mary brought the empty wine situation, not with an elaborate explanation, not with a carefully reasoned theological argument for why your need deserves divine attention, but simply and honestly, I have run out. I have no more. The jars are empty, and I am bringing them to you because you are the only one who can do anything real about it. And then listen for the instruction, because it will come. It may not look like what you expect. It may sound, when it comes, completely disconnected from the specific problem. You are trying to fill the purification jars with water in the middle of a wine shortage, which is to say, Do the next ordinary act of faithfulness in the middle of a joy shortage. Return to the practice. Fill the jar. Keep showing up. Keep praying the prayer that feels like talking into a ceiling. Keep sitting in the pew on the Sunday when the worship feels hollow. Keep honoring the commitment on the day when honoring it feels like maintaining a shell rather than inhabiting a life. Fill the jars with water, not because the water is the solution, but because the water is what you have, and the water is what He works with, and the water is what He transforms when the obedience is complete, and the filling is to the brim, and you have done everything He said to do with everything you had to do it with, and then draw it out and take it to the master of the banquet. Meaning at some point, stop filling and start moving. Stop waiting in the back room with the stone jars and start walking toward the celebration with what you have drawn. Because the miracle is not confirmed in the jars. It is confirmed in the pouring, in the willingness to bring what you have drawn uncertain, still not fully understanding, still not sure that what you are carrying is what the situation needs, and set it before the one who will taste it and tell you what it is. There is one more thing the Cana story wants to say to you before it closes. The miracle produced 120 to 180 gallons of wine for one wedding, in one evening, in a small village in Galilee. God is not a God of barely enough. He is not a God of just sufficient. When He restores what has run dry, He restores it in abundance, more than the need required, better than what was lost, overflowing past the capacity of the original need and into excess that can be shared with everyone at the table. Your empty jars are not too empty for Him. Your depletion is not too great for Him. Your stone jar faith and your water-level joy and your purification jar, religious life that has been technically maintained, but spiritually hollow for longer than you want to admit. None of it is beyond what He can transform, because He turned water into wine. The most ordinary substance available, water, drawn from a well, poured into stone, into the finest wine that anyone at the party had ever tasted. He is the same Jesus today, at the same kind of table, in the middle of the same kind of ordinary human celebration. He is invited into your life, and He has come willingly, and He is sitting at your table right now. And the empty jars are visible to Him before you have said a word, and He already knows what He is going to do. Bring Him your empty jars. Fill them to the brim with whatever ordinary faithfulness you have left to pour. Do whatever He tells you. And be ready, be genuinely ready to taste something that makes the master of your inner banquet call you over and say, you have no idea what has just been placed in your cup. This is the finest wine. Better than the beginning, better than the early season, better than the first excitement and the first passion and the first freshness that you have been grieving the loss of, because He saves the best for last. Not as a theological principle that sounds comforting in the abstract, as a living reality that has been proven in the stone jars of every faithful, imperfect, water-filling, jar-to-the-brim person who has ever brought their depletion to the one who transforms what we bring. Your best wine has not been poured yet. The celebration is not over. The master of the banquet has not yet tasted what Jesus is preparing in the jars of your ordinary, faithful, continued life. The good wine is coming, and when it arrives, drawn from the stone jars of your imperfect and persistent obedience, poured out in the moment. He says now, taste it in the place where you had stopped expecting anything but water. It will be better than anything that came before it. The party is not over. The best wine is last, and He is already at your table.